For Netanyahu, the best thing that could happen would be for an American to become a casualty in this war. So he doesn't want them to be taken to safety. He wants them to remain in harm's way. There's a lot of debate, particularly in the United States, but I think globally too, about what role the United States is playing, might play, is going to play, might not play. And while that's very important, particularly if we do see a direct offensive military role of the United States, particularly with its giant high-powered bombs to attack at the Fordo nuclear enrichment plant or something like that. But what we do know, I think, is the most important thing. What we know is that Israel could not carry out this kind of assault on Iran, which it began more than a week ago, and would not have been possible if not for the level of U.S. military support. The U.S. is providing 68% of all of Israel's weapons. The financial support, the U.S. is covering 40% of the entire Israeli military spending. And crucially, the political protection that makes sure that Israel is not held accountable in the UN, in the International Criminal Court, in the International Court of Justice, in any way that is fast and meaningful. So with all of that, the question of whether the White House gave a green light or a blinking yellow light is less important. What's more important is that the United States remains complicit in this illegal assault that Israel waged against Iran. The tension between Israel and Iran dates back to the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Before 1979, Iran and Israel were two of the major allies of the United States in the Middle East. They all got along famously, not least because they were not Arab countries. Along with Turkey, the three countries were by far the most important allies for the United States in that era when the question of oil was by far the overwhelming issue shaping U.S. policy in the region. The oil question is, of course, still important, but it's not now the most important question for the United States. But what changed after the Islamic Revolution in 1979 is that Iran broke with its relations with the U.S., and in doing so broke its relations with Israel as well. And the tensions have been high ever since. Iran has supported in various ways, usually exaggerated in the Western press, but has had relations with a variety of both governments and non-governmental militias and forces throughout the region that were opposed to the U.S. role in the region and particularly opposed to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land and its attacks and seizure of land in surrounding countries, whether it was in Lebanon, where Iran had its relationship with Hezbollah, in Syria, where Iran had a longstanding relationship with the government of Hafez al-Assad and his son, Bashar al-Assad, and in Yemen, where Iran backed the Houthi rebels who opposed Saudi Arabia and Israel, who were both bombing in Yemen. So we have a long-standing relationship of tension. In the period since Israel launched its most recent genocide against Gaza that began 21 months ago, those resistance forces, with some ties to Iran, have played a role in supporting Palestinians, in most cases simply rhetorically, in the case of the Houthis, in attacking, preventing Israeli ships from carrying weapons to and from Israel. But in that period, Israel escalated massively its assaults on the neighboring countries, and now we see it expanding to Iran directly. In 2024, during the genocide, Israel attacked Iran directly. In one case, it was the bombing of the Iranian diplomatic offices in Syria. In the other case, it was the assassination of Palestinian and Lebanese leaders, one of whom was assassinated in Tehran. And in both of those cases, Iran retaliated with small-scale bombing, mainly using drones, against Israel. In that context, the escalation remains kind of a very strong point of tension between Iran and Israel in this recent period. So when we saw the Israeli assault that began on June 12th, at a moment when the negotiations between Iran and the United States were underway, had made progress, and were scheduled to meet again just 2 days later, just 48 hours after that first bombing attack by Israel against Iran. Very surprising. There was no expectation that that was going to happen. The US had made clear they intended to go to the negotiation session in Oman on that following Sunday. The bombing began on very late Thursday night in the US and early Friday morning in Iran. And yet the bombing began, scuttling the possibility for negotiations to continue. So, this notion that what Israel had done was somehow a preemptive attack, the only thing they preempted was more negotiations to prevent a war. Negotiations on a new nuclear deal with Iran, presumably similar to the nuclear deal that had been negotiated by President Obama back in 2015. And that deal, which was working, the US agreed that Iran was in compliance, the Europeans agreed Iran was in compliance, the United Nations inspectors agreed Iran was in compliance, everybody agreed Iran was in compliance. And yet, the Israeli position was the deal isn't good enough, we're not going to accept it. Trump took up the Israeli position and scuttled the deal, walked away from it, said, no, it's not a good enough deal, I'm going to get a better deal. Of course, he didn't get a better deal, he got no deal. And the tensions erupted even more strongly. Iran is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, and therefore it is not allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Because there was so much tension in the region between Iran and Washington's allies, there has been extra focus on the possibility that Iran at some point in the future might get or might create or might build a nuclear weapon. Everybody agrees that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, does not have a nuclear weapons program, is not building a nuclear weapon, and yet there has been a divide. It's the one issue in which there is a big divide between the US position and the Israeli position. The US has said consistently, and this included President Trump in his first term, and until just a few weeks ago in his second term, the position that Iran must not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. The Israeli position goes way beyond that and says not only is it prohibited for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, but Iran may not have any nuclear capability, any ability to enrich its own uranium. It may not have a civilian nuclear program for research, for medical uses. It cannot have any kind of a nuclear program at all. Not surprisingly, that has been a no-go position for Iran. They have the right to have a civilian nuclear program like every other member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And we should be very clear here that Israel, unlike all the other countries in the Middle East, is not a member, has never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And yet, the only nuclear weapons arsenal in the region belongs to one country. It's not Iran, it's Israel. Israel has an arsenal of nuclear weapons, somewhere between 90 and 400 weapons in its nuclear laboratories in Dimona. It has never acknowledged those weapons. They have never been brought under any kind of inspection regime by the United Nations. So Israel remains the only country in the region that has nuclear weapons. If at any point in the future Iran decided it was going to build a nuclear weapon, even then, what it would threaten is not an existential threat to the people of Israel. It would only threaten Israel's nuclear monopoly, which it now holds in the region as the only nuclear weapons state. So that's the context in which all of this takes place. Israel has nuclear weapons, Iran does not. Israel has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran has. Iran's nuclear program, which is not a weapons program, remains under very harsh examination and inspection by United Nations inspectors. Israel's existing weapons, which are widely known to the world, pictures were released by an Israeli worker there in the 1980s who escaped with the pictures, took them public, and then was later kidnapped and brought back to Israel and spent 18 years in prison, most of it in solitary confinement. So the world knows that Israel has nuclear weapons. They were created in collaboration with then apartheid South Africa, beginning in the 1970s. This is not a secret. But Israel does not acknowledge it. The United States holds to that, and also almost never, there's been a few mistakes by US diplomats, but almost never acknowledges that Israel has nuclear weapons. And somehow the existence of those nuclear weapons are never considered a serious threat to the peace and stability of the region. Only the fact that Iran has a non-weapons civilian nuclear program, that is somehow considered the only threat to the region that needs to be dealt with. So it's a very unequal scenario that we're dealing with here. And it's one that's very dangerous because the US has now moved towards the Israeli position. Beyond the US position, Iran must not have a nuclear weapon. They are now taking up sometimes, and President Trump on so many different issues goes from one position to another, back to the first, back to the second, back to the first. You never really know where he stands. But on occasion, he has gone away from the longstanding US position that Iran may not have a nuclear weapon and has taken up the Israeli position that says Iran may not have any kind of nuclear enrichment. And that's why they are talking about using the one massive ordnance, the biggest bomb in the United States arsenal that is not a nuclear weapon itself. The United States and Russia, of course, have the largest number of nuclear weapons in the world. But this is a 30,000 pound bomb that can only be dropped by one of the giant US bombers, a B-2 bomber. If that were to happen, that's the only possibility of even partially injuring the major enrichment project in Fordo, which is buried under a mountain. In that context, the role of the United States could be to lead this from being a very tense war between Iran and Israel into a potentially regional war and perhaps even something that becomes global. So it's a very, very dangerous moment that we are in. One of the challenges for people trying to sort out what President Trump intends to do is that he has a long-standing habit of refusing to say what his intentions are, and when he does, changing his position an hour later. He has flip-flopped back and forth about whether he knew about the Israeli strike initially on Iran. First he said we had nothing to do with it. Then he said it's a very good thing, and he implied that the US did know. We don't know. He has said in the last hours and the last days, both, I want to talk to the Iranians. We can talk. We should talk. It's late, but we can still talk. And he has said, it's probably too late. I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do. Maybe I'm going to drop a bomb. Maybe I'm not. You don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do. It's an astonishing thing for the President of the United States, the so-called leader of the so-called free world, but certainly the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military force that has ever existed, to take such a lighthearted position on his decision making about whether to take the world to war. We stand on the precipice of a very, very dangerous war. And there's very little way to know how likely it is that that's going to happen. It's just very, very dangerous that there's any possibility that it could. So we have to do everything possible. This would be a US military action without legal authority. It would be in violation of the US Constitution that says that only the Congress, the Parliament, has the right to declare war, that the president commands in a war but does not have the right to declare a war. If he went in without a declaration of war, that would be a violation of both US law and international law. So this is a very, very dangerous moment that we are entering. It's very difficult to know what Trump plans to do, partly because his advisors have many different opinions, and we're never clear which of his advisors he's listening to. For example, the US ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who President Trump said was, a trusted advisor to him, He's a long-standing Christian Zionist, long well known for his support not only for Israel, but for Zionism as an ideological and indeed theological position. So he has been fighting back, interestingly, against Netanyahu when he told Netanyahu that the US was thinking of evacuating large numbers of Americans from Israel and from the region for their safety, because they're obviously at risk right now. Civilians are being killed in both countries. We should say that the number of civilians being killed in Iran is far higher than the number of civilians being killed in Israel, which I think are still in the low 20s. Several hundred have already been killed in Iran. But nonetheless, people are at risk. And not surprisingly, the US government said we might want to evacuate Americans from the region. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, immediately fought back and said, "How dare you? You shouldn't take them out." Well, why would he want them there? Because if an American should be hurt or killed in this bombing by an Iranian bomb, or frankly, by a US bomb that the Israelis are dropping that went astray, for example, there would be almost no way that Trump would not feel compelled to enter the war. So for Netanyahu, the best thing that could happen would be for an American to become a casualty in this war. So he doesn't want them to be taken to safety. He wants them to remain in harm's way. This is what this war, as it emerges, has led us to.